welcome to Across the Fence. I'm Jolie Whitney. Do you remember when phrases like contact tracing, flattening the curve, and essential workers were part of your everyday conversations? Life Became Very Blurry, an oral history of COVID-19 in Vermont, was recently published by the Vermont Historical Society. It follows a major project by the Historical Society called Collecting COVID-19, which involves the gathering of more than 100 oral histories about the COVID-19 pandemic. The editor of our book is our guest today. Garrett Graff grew up in Vermont and spent 2 decades covering politics, technology, national security, and he's a columnist for the Washington Post, and he joins us today. Thank you so much for coming in.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me today.
And where were you when you first heard about this COVID-19 pandemic?
I was actually on February break in South Carolina at the beach, and I remember sort of reading about it in the newspaper and being like, you know, this kind of seems like this is a bigger deal than, like, people are talking about this in a way that makes this seem like a bigger deal than it kind of seems like it is at this exact moment. And then I was home in Vermont that second week in March when sort of the world shut down, and I didn't leave for almost a year and a half.
Sure, and the rest they say is history.
It is.
And what was your first reaction?
Well, I think part of what was, I think, so challenging for everyone, and this comes through in a lot of these oral histories, is the uncertainty of those first couple of weeks. That there was real fear, real terror, I think, for a lot of people about what was coming. And then I think one of the other things that really comes through to me, reading about these oral histories, even just 5 years later, is how much of the pandemic I have already forgotten about. That we talk about the pandemic as a single thing, but it really wasn't. And when you get back into the timeline of it, there were a lot of different distinct periods of the pandemic that I think, again, have all blurred together, which is part of the reason we ended up with this book title, Life Becomes Very Blurry, because we have, those first couple of weeks, like, there was a sense, I think, for a lot of people, like, oh, it's 2 weeks to stop the spread. Okay, it'll be maybe a little bit longer than that, but we'll be open by Easter. That was the original goal. And then all of a sudden, there was sort of this dawning realization over the course of that spring, okay, like, we're not coming out of this anytime soon.
Absolutely. And you were talking before we started filming about the range of experiences that people had, even just across Vermont. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think one of the unique challenges of recording and remembering and understanding COVID-19 as history is just how atomizing the experience of the pandemic really was for people. That there was no typical experience of the pandemic. That so much of the way that any of us lived that was reflective of our family status, our income status, our economic status, our health status, our professional status, where you lived. Even people on the same block or the same street in Vermont did not have similar COVID experiences. And in fact, Vermont did not have a typical COVID experience as opposed or contrasted with a lot of other states and a lot of other parts of the country. And I think that was a big part of the motivation for the Vermont Historical Society to begin this project. Was it is the only state-level oral history historical record project in the country at this point. And I think a lot of their initial impetus for trying to pull together this collection of artifacts and histories was to try to understand Vermont's uniqueness as an experience and as a state.
And this isn't your first time covering an oral history. You did one on 9/11 and D-Day. So what do you think as a career this has driven you to covering oral histories?
Yeah, I think part of what makes me so interested in oral history is the way that it puts you back in the experiences of the people who are living through these historical moments, knowing only the things that they knew at the time. That I think often in narrative history, and I've written plenty of narrative history in my career as well, that it's easy to make things seem more sort of neat and clean and simple and straightforward than they were for anyone living through them at the time. For those of us on March 11th, when the world shut down, we didn't know that it was not going to be 2 weeks. We didn't know that there was going to be this incredible effort, Operation Warp Speed, to deliver vaccines by the end of the year. We didn't know, anything about the scale of the tragedy that was about to unfold across the country. We thought those first couple of weeks, where there were like hundreds of deaths, was remarkable. And then, the scale increased to thousands, tens of thousands, 100,000, and ultimately more than 1 million Americans.
And you've already kind of touched on this a little bit, but what set aside this work from the other ones you've done, other oral histories?
I think part of what made this project, again, challenging was to try to find the common themes that came out. And that's actually how we ended up organizing the book. That it's 14 chapters, as any good Vermont book, history book should be. 14 state, 14 counties, 14 chapters. And we pulled out sort of different themes: family, faith, community, what work was like, what school was like. We have a chapter on the state response, on the legislature's response. And that what you see, again, is how different people's experiences were in every corner of the state. If you were in a small town, if you were in a rural community, if you were in a big city, if you were in a communal living situation, if you were a college student, if you were a frontline worker, if you were a remote worker, you just had vastly different experiences across the pandemic.
And you interview only people from Vermont, but how did you choose the people that you spoke with for this?
Yeah, so the Vermont Historical Society got a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences to do this project. Unfortunately, that's one of the institutions that the Trump administration has shut down, so that support for local libraries and local museums is now gone, at least I hope temporarily. But this grant covered both the collection of a set of artifacts, so pamphlets and medical records, and the governor's press conferences through the pandemic, the data presentations that the state gave, as well as the hiring of a handful of oral historians, training them up, and then sending them out across the state to conduct these interviews. It ended up being about 110 total interviews across the state, trying to get into as many different corners of the state, as many different types of stories as the Historical Society could collect. And so, again, it ranges from the state health commissioner, Mark Levine, down to farmers and retail workers and students and teachers and librarians and all sorts of people all across the state.
And how many people were carrying these interviews out?
There were 3 oral historians who were brought on for the project, and then some of the Vermont Historical Society staff chipped in as well. So there are sort of 4 or 5 different interviewers who, and they went into this, they went into each of these conversations with only the barest of scripts, because, again, part of the challenge of this is everyone had such different experiences. And again, this is talking about, a 2-year period of people's lives. And so not everyone had very vivid, very strong memories of the whole thing. People sort of had moments that shaped them across this pandemic. And of course, part of the challenge of collecting history this close to the history unfolding is that we're still very much in this pandemic, and that's something that we wrestle with in the book. But what we really tried to focus on was the period of what you might call the peak pandemic, from roughly the spring of March 2020 through when vaccines became available widespread in 2021, and that first fall of the vaccines and the Omicron and the Delta variants.
And how far after the country kind of shut down in 2020 did you guys start interviewing?
So they were talking about this project actually by the end of 2021, and then the interviews, I think, unfolded mostly across 2023 and 2024.
And the governor's press conferences were almost daily during the
Yes.
pandemic, and they were really lauded for their frankness and their openness. How was Vermont's leadership really reflected in the book?
Well, and I think, again, that's part of what makes Vermont's experience so unique, is that for so many states across the country, I think communities and states ended up more polarized at the end of the pandemic than they did at the start. And Vermont came together. Part of what I found inspiring in working through this project was how Vermont really did live its values through the pandemic. We took care of our neighbors. There was a strong sense of community spirit, a strong sense of balancing as our state does, freedom and unity at the same time. And that we trusted our state leaders. Our state leaders did their best to live up to that trust in talking sort of frankly and openly with the state. And you have to remember, again, for many states, like, this was an intensely polarizing experience. I mean, states like Michigan, Idaho, Oregon, they experienced armed uprisings in their states over mask policies, over lockdowns. I mean, you had Michigan and Idaho, armed groups storming the state capitals at various times, showdowns with law enforcement. And that's just not what Vermont had. And we really did our best as a state, as small, 241 communities, to take care of our neighbors, to take care of our students, to take care of the most vulnerable as best we could.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And Life Became Very Blurry, an oral history of the COVID-19 pandemic in Vermont, is available wherever you get your books. And here on Across the Fence, we always encourage you to visit your local library. On your screen is the web address to the Vermont Historical Society, where you can also get this book. I want to thank the crew behind the scenes here at WCAX who make our program possible. I'm Jolie Whitney. This is Across the Fence. Have a good one.